Welcome to the Dystopian Renaissance. We cover spirituality, healing, consciousness, and truth. In this chaotic world we live in, it's important to get out of the matrix, and we'll do just that with biohacking, nutrition, spiritual awakenings, alternative healing, and freedom. This is the Dystopian Renaissance, and this is your host, Johnny Sage.
I'm sitting with Dr. Daniel Atkins today, and he's an intuitive psychologist. Daniel, thank you for coming in today. How did your journey start, or what did you awaken? When did all this begin?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Johnny. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll say, when I get asked that question, it's really, I always find I'm starting with birth. When I came into the world, right? That's when the journey starts. But I struggled a lot as a kid. I got a lot of diagnoses, ADHD, OCD, depression, anxiety. I struggled. I had a lot of fear, a lot of behavioral challenges, and I just never felt, enough. So from an early age, I was always seeking opportunities to find that, to fill that, to understand what this life was about. On the surface, for me, emotions were always prominent, were always my first lens in experiencing reality. So emotions were always something that I was curious about, always wanting to understand on a deeper level. In my teens and young adulthood, ended up exploring a lot of substances and some substance use, because that was one of the first ways that I felt I could get free of a lot of the emotional baggage and experience different states, creative states that led to feelings of bliss and joy and things I had not experienced a lot of outside of that. Also was introduced to Buddhist philosophy by my dad, and so had started exploring these other realms. Obviously, substance use is not the best way to create a life for yourself of sustained passion and joy. And ultimately studied psychology in college and later on went back to grad school to pursue clinical psychology. But during that time had gotten very sick. So after college, had this really medically unexplainable, sustained chronic pain and fatigue experience. I got the label of chronic fatigue syndrome, but there was no biomedical etiology. I ended up studying it, wrote my dissertation on it. And through the experience of sickness, which went on for like 10 plus years, started exploring mind-body medicine, understanding on a deeper level, even deeper than the training I was getting as a psychologist, how mind and body work together, how not just the physical symptoms, but all the emotional strife were manifestations of early life conditioning, what we might call trauma. Learned about the nervous system, learned about breath, just really learned and saw very clearly how for however many years up until that point, I'd been living in fear. A lot of my decisions were based on fear or based on the hopes of alleviating fear. And so at the sort of what appeared to be the conclusion of my professional journey, my training, getting the internship I wanted, getting the degree that I was working for, getting the license, I was still getting sick weekly. I mean, I'd gotten percentages better. I'd grown a lot as a person. I'd matured. I'd stopped using all substances, but there was still something that felt unfulfilled. I was still living in some ways driven by fear. I was still wanting to be approved of by my supervisors, by my peers, wanting to be smart enough, good enough. And the journey keeps going because you get the degree, you get the license. There's always going to be something else that you're striving to get. There's always going to be something else to hopefully fill whatever that is. And at that point is when, out of really desperation, I'd been introduced to other ways of knowing. I started meeting with healers, people who call themselves all sorts of things, intuitives, clairvoyants, shamans. I was introduced to energy medicine. And I was just at a place of readiness to start opening to other modalities. mostly because when I'd experienced something, I felt it so deeply. I experienced all my symptoms vanish with certain types of energetic body-based practices. I felt speaking with intuitives I wasn't just able to take in the language or the words, but I could feel shifts in the energetic body. I recognized that I had an energetic body. I recognized that a lot of what I was experiencing in early life was not just sort of what we call emotional attunement, but a source of energy within me, picking up energy in my environments, picking up energy from those I was around. And that just totally expanded my journey. I just started learning a lot about energy tools. I started learning about how to protect my own energy, to clear out what was no longer serving me. And just these layers of doubt and fear started to peel away as I had more confidence and conviction in taking bigger leaps for my life. I ended up leaving my clinic. I started writing a lot. I started working in a more holistic way. And so, if we want to call it sort of an awakening, which is an ongoing journey, but I would say the most pivotal point for me came probably a couple of years ago, leaving my clinic and starting to take those leaps.
Well, a lot of good stuff there. Thank you for sharing that. I guess I'll start with, when you notice your sensitivity, do you think like people that have suffered trauma early on, like that we needed that to become more sensitive? Or what's your theory of like why some people have like higher sensitivity than others?
I think it's always a medicine, and I think we don't come into the world as blank slates. So, I don't think we come into the world as blank slates only to be painted over by the colors of experience. I think whatever traumas we've experienced in early life are likely reenactments of some ancestral lineage. We can call it karmic lineage too. On some spiritual perspective, I believe we really do come in here to learn certain lessons, and those play out in terms of the reenacted traumas or early life or ongoing life experiences that we continue to have until we ultimately learn those lessons and can transmute some of what appears to be darkness into light. So I'm not even sure that, let's say, specific instances of trauma or certain instances that were life-threatening made us sensitive, but we were likely sensitive beings already. On some level, I believe we're all intuitive beings, and we all exist on a spectrum of being able to tune in to the energies of the world and the energies within ourselves. If there's a traumatic circumstance that leaves our nervous system frazzled, chronically activated, hypervigilant, scanning for danger and threat, which we all do on a survival level, but let's say it gets really activated in that one experience, I don't believe anything was being put into us that wasn't already there to be elicited. And then it can be used. It can be used as fuel to transmute. But I think sometimes the issue in, let's say, more traditional clinical worlds is we use that one instance and we build a whole narrative and story around that instance of abuse or assault or neglect, rather than seeing it as a really important reenactment of a longer story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're right, because even just to explain why we have all different aptitudes, like, is that sheerly genetic? Some people would probably argue that, but just at our interests too, like those aren't necessarily genetic because we have different interests than a lot of our family members. So it makes sense what you said, that we don't come just a completely blank slate. Like we're just born here and that's a completely fresh start. I mean, it's a fresh start in some extent, but not like there's more to it than what we're being told. And that makes, and there's been actually research on it now too. They really, I don't want to say proven, but I mean, I'm sure you heard of Many Lives, Many Masters.
It's one of my favorite books. I recommend it to so many people.
Thanks. Yeah, if someone's like new to this, I recommend that as well. Because once you read that, you're like, okay, this is started. That's a great introduction word for someone who's skeptical. And
yeah, because of Brian Weiss's story and his training and where he came from.
Yeah, exactly. He has like a kind of like methodical scientific approach to it. It's not just like woo, like just take my word for it.
No, he was like a neuroscientist, and his background, I believe he went to Yale and Columbia, clearly a very smart guy reporting this experience.
Exactly. So that's what introduced me to really starting to really believe that concept. And then it went further from there. Like there was another book, I forget the name of offhand, but there was this like 5-year-old kid, and he recalled the interior of this fighter jet in a completely another country. And it was totally accurate. All the pictures on the walls. And this wasn't something that he could have found on the internet, or no one else would have really known it. So just occurrences like that, like stuff like this keeps happening. So at some point you have to be like, okay, there is more to this than just I'm born and die and that's it,
Well, and, even if people aren't, even as, I find those books very interesting and convincing in their own right. But even if people aren't open to the idea of, let's say, karmic inheritance or reincarnation, you can look, like you said, about what's being proven or studied. You can look at clinical research and, the modern edge of trauma research in fields of clinical psychology and medicine, and they're studying epigenetics. They're studying epigenetic inheritance, which is sort of not changes at the level of the gene, but the expression of genes. And so they, look back historically. My family is Jewish, so a lot of the research studies, let's say, examples of the Holocaust and what happens in generations following the experience. And there's chronic activation in the stress response. There's decreased levels of cortisol. So there's a lot of biophysiological changes that get passed on. So on that level, we can see that ancestral lineage isn't that woo of an idea, that we're not coming in as blank slates, not just in terms of how tall we are or the colors of our eyes, but on some level, how our nervous systems are wired. And that, in my opinion, then gets to the level of the conditioned beliefs or proclivities to emotion states, which starts to bleed into how we see the world.
Yeah, and a lot of good points there. And also touch back on the energy body when you realize that, because that was an important realization, I thought. Because science has picked up on biofield energy now, but seems like we kind of ignore it too. We know it's there. Has been research on it, both with the Curly photography and some other things. So we know it's there, but we don't really develop that knowledge. And it's like, okay, we'll just stick to the old system. And do you think there's ways we could incorporate that into more mainstream practices?
100%. And I think we already do. We just don't like to acknowledge that because from my experience, the clinical world of psychology, energy is just a very woo word. So people don't want to use it. But what we're saying about emotions, when you get trained as a psychologist, where you're trained to sort of attune to the client, right? Or when you sit down with someone, how does it feel to be with them in the room? Or like anyone, walking into a party and sensing that it has what do we think emotions are, right? They seem to be energetic source material. And is that exactly the same as other kinds of energy when we're talking about the quantum field or things like that? I don't know. But to me, it really makes sense that when we're talking about the energetic chakra system, that, the idea of emotions, beliefs, which in some ways are just more conditioned extensions of thoughts, that these are energetic sources of material. Like, what else do we think they are? And I think what we really do is we just avoid trying to identify what the existence of these things are, but using a word like energy to describe the source material of those things, as well as trauma. Like trauma, to me, we have a lot of ideas about what trauma is, how it impacts the nervous system, the dramatic stories that play out. But the source material of trauma, I would call an energetic source material of conditioned beliefs about ourselves, others, and how we see the world, and the associated emotion states. So to me, it's useful to speak in the language of energy.
Yeah, and you're right. That's a funny observation about energy could be a woo term. And it can be overused and
For
used
sure.
by superficial people, which can kind of make matrix people apprehensive about it, like they'll be, because like now everyone's just throwing the term around out there for, I don't want to say in inappropriate ways, but just in like insincere ways. And that how I would have made me roll my eyes. And if I wasn't already into it, I probably would have been even not eager to get into it,
Well, and that's why I stick with what I feel I can make accessible. Speaking about beliefs and emotions, people don't think that that's woo, but it's not any less woo than energy, because you can't see beliefs and emotions either, but we collectively agree that they exist. And one example I'll give is at the halftime of a football game, what do we assume a coach is doing for their players, right? Are they maybe they're giving them a playbook for strategy and they're reviewing things like that. But what they're doing is they're amplifying the emotion energy and the belief. The coach is attempting to inject the idea that they can go out and win, to amplify the belief and emotion energy, because it matters, right? I think everyone would agree in sports performance and psychology that the belief, the possibility that you can go out and win, and the emotion that supports that, whether we're being, more woo about it and speaking about manifestation, or just aligning with the idea that it's going to impact your performance, I think those are ways to bridge the gap between the language of energy and how we work with our inner experience.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And that makes sense. You're right. What do people really think's going on, either when an emotion comes up or something along those lines? Does it just come out of nowhere? Is it just a organ that just says, okay, be angry now? Or
is it just some physiological process? Is it just neurotransmitters in the brain? There was a book written by Candace Pert about the molecules of emotion, where she purported to identify these neuropeptides as the biological basis for emotion. But on some level, for me, it makes sense that the biological structures of what we are can be correlates for the energetic body, and they can work in tandem. That the brain, very important biological structure to our whole process, but not necessarily the source of what we are.
Also, an overused phrase now is everything is energy. It does seem more people are realizing that. So that is true, but we're still not, we know that. So if everything is, that's including us, but we're still not bringing that, we're not using all that, we're not bringing that into the conversation as much, like people like me and you are, but as a whole. So I think we're really missing out on what it's capable of.
I think that, what people are really attracted to and convinced by, particularly in Western society, is brain-based language. So neuroscience is very popular. And so if we can talk about how neurotransmitters and neural pathways are wired in the brain, this is very convincing because it sounds very intellectual. It sounds very, and it is very scientific. But I think we can fall into the same trap if we just associate everything to the brain and we think that healing is just only about rewiring and the neuroplasticity of the brain. From my perspective, that's a correlate. So the healing process is going to impact positively the brain. But if you just try to narrow down the healing journey to how you sort of manipulate the brain structure, you're going to be missing out on something that's a bit more of the witnessing experience of what it means to be alive.
Yeah, and even someone who just wants to focus on physicality, it's been said over the past few years or so that now the gut might be the first brain, the brain's the second brain, as crazy as that sounds. And it actually has been argued well, when you hear what they're saying. So I think we really have to be open-minded about, we can't just be stuck on what we were taught. And no matter what your theory is, I think it's really good to be more open-minded than just what you were taught originally, and be open to new ideas, no matter if you want a spiritual perspective, physical perspective. There's a lot more going on, and the technology's changing and theories as well.
Well, yeah, this is what research is coming out to support, which is that we are much more embodied beings than just brain-based beings, and that, like you said, there's thousands and thousands of neurons and neuronal connections in the heart and the gut that send more information to the brain than vice versa. So, when we're talking about the brain, we're really talking about the entire nervous system and all these areas, which can align with the chakras as well and the energetic system. But yeah, they hold, whether we want to call it intuitive wisdom or intelligence, these other aspects of our body are perceiving our reality and dictating what we come to know and feel just as much as the brain.
And the heart's another area that goes overlooked in our society too. Places like the Heart Math Institute are bringing real research forward on it that shows that's really underutilized. The way I grew up too, just focused on it was it's either healthy or it's not, but there's so much more.
It's pumping or it's not.
There's either blockage or, it's like, but it's coming out. There's so much more to it. There's really an intelligence there as well.
Yeah, and we can talk on the level of sort of it produces an electromagnetic pulse and field, even more than the brain, but also on the level of, for me personally, and I know a lot of people who trained as psychologists as well, we talk a lot about emotions so we can sound really smart in speaking to them, but actually experiencing them on the level of the heart is a totally different thing. I mean, I was very caught in my head. I was a very heady person for many, many years and sort of prided and idealized that level of intellectualism. And yet it led me nowhere in my healing journey. I was completely cut off. I was sick, depressed, and in pain. And it really was what may sound like a cliche, but coming from the head to the heart is so much about not just the healing experience, but coming into authentically who we are and who we want to be, because feelings aren't necessarily facts either, but coming into what we might call sort of the feelings consciousness gives us a more accurate portrayal of where we are in this moment, what we're holding on to, what we're resisting, what we want to create, what we want to experience, versus the thinking mind, which oftentimes is based on these conditioned and fear-based patterns.
That's a really good point. And something I forgot about too was when I was starting my healing journey, when I would feel depressed or anxious, I would make a note of that to be like, okay, well, I have to go and do this. And then I would do that and it wouldn't really help. And then I would get more in my head. So I was trying to analyze my way out of anxiety or depression. And it would just get you further and further down the hole and you just get more anxious. Like, why isn't this working? That's really an amazing insight that if you just try to heal yourself logically, that might not always be the best scenario.
It never really works, and we're all kind of wired to do it because we've evolved to have these very extensive and complex and powerful brains, but our brains, and what we might extend to say is the mind, is really just conditioned based on the way we see the world, just conditioned based on our beliefs, and a lot of those beliefs are limited. So the thinking patterns are naturally not really wired to help us heal. They're wired to help us survive. And so we can use logic and reason to navigate the world, but a lot of the thoughts which are wired from this belief system are going to be based really on what I would call the ego, or an illusion of separateness, of competition, of trying to be enough and prove ourselves worthy in various ways, whichever way we are attempting to enact that in our circumstances. None of it is going to ultimately lead us to being with the feelings, because we try to replicate it in our circumstances. We try to be successful. We try to get the relationships we want. We try to get enough money or validated with degrees or awards or whatever we think we want to create in our circumstances. Ultimately, we do it because we want to feel a certain way. And so we're playing this out in our circumstances so many times, hoping that it will get us to feel a certain way, when actually ironically, it's really just about going directly to the feelings. If we want to feel a certain way, we can actually practice feeling a certain way rather than needing to see it play out in the circumstance.
Yeah, totally. And that kind of ties into what you said near the beginning too, how you were kind of goal focused at the beginning. And I was really guilty of that for a long time was, oh, I'll be happy when I make that next milestone. Like it's not happening now, but I just got to get this. And then that can happen. And then I'm not happy. I'm like, well, not now because I got to get this now. And it's like, it's just this moving goalpost, like you said, I just think it's designed to take you out of the present moment. And like you said, you got to focus on now. You can take control of how you're feeling now. So that's the important thing, not just by trying to reach a goal or if I get this or achieve that, then I'll be this positive emotional state.
I mean, we see it so clearly in our society. We see that celebrities and millionaires and billionaires are no happier than anyone else, really. So they may be more comfortable in some ways, but they're not happier. So, and yet the conditioning, when we don't really look at the conditioned beliefs that are guiding our path, we just naturally think, okay, yeah, when I get more clients, when I have more money coming in, when I have a different relationship, when I'm out of a relationship, yeah, it's all this future conditioned thinking rather than recognizing that the inner creates the outer. So the inner creates the outer. So if there's resistance inside, we can use the healing practices that you offer or that many offer to be with those feelings. There's nothing necessarily we need to do outside to learn how to be our own caregiver and to learn how to be our own container for those feelings and for those beliefs. Recognize if they're serving us, sit with them if we need to, but ultimately create different emotion states that we want to be with. We forget that we're creators, that we're all, whether you consider yourself an artist or not, we create our reality in every moment. We create emotions that we want to experience, and we can actually practice creating good ones.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing you said was, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it, because I even catch myself that I'll think about when I awakened or ask when someone else awakened, but it's really not just one awakening. It's an ongoing process, because I mean, obviously, I'm sure you know that is like, I consider like the initial awakening, like when you kind of knew something was wrong and started thinking of things in different terms or something like that. But you're right. It's like, we don't really just have one awakening. A lot of us go much further too, and new information will come to light that might change our even old opinion after that initial awakening.
And I think for some people, they do see it that way. And for some people, like, let's say like Eckhart Tolle, he can write about a very specific instance, and that is how it unfolds for them. I don't see myself in that way. I don't see myself enlightened really in that way at all. I just see my journey unfolding, and I see myself getting freer. I just see myself getting freer and freer and letting go of conditioned beliefs. And that's just what I see. And then in my circumstances, I see myself moving out of pain, moving out of chronic states of unhappiness, and just experiencing more possibilities and bliss than I knew of. And I see that playing out in my circumstances because of the leaps and decisions I've made. So that's kind of how I see it. And then I can point to instances where I, in retrospect, all these things that served me and helped me get to this point. But yeah, it always looks like a journey when I look back at it.
Yeah, and I just thought of this funny memory that a different instructor at something completely different, he was telling the story about how a student came up to him and said, I just had multiple epiphanies. And he's like, I don't think you know what that word really means then. And I guess, yeah, you could probably, if you're having like awakenings all the time, they're probably not really awakenings. So yeah, I guess it could go the other way too. But I guess what I was trying to say is that I just want to clarify, but I'm sure you understand this, but yeah, is like we can change our course even after that initial awakening as well. So that's yeah, because some people, you're right, not everyone's like the person you referenced where their awakening's like enlightenment or considered enlightenment. It's some of us are like on a slower path, which is okay too. And
most of us.
Yeah, most of us.
Most of us. Pretty much all of us.
Yeah, because some of those people that were claimed to be enlightened had some fallouts afterwards too.
And I don't think any of us really are immune from the human experience, which is about change and growth. I really believe that's what we come here to do until we leave. And yeah, for me, there are instances where I might speak about it in terms of levels of readiness, where I reached a point of readiness to make changes and to make pivots in my life that I had not been ready to, and getting to that point of readiness to not just make changes in my circumstances, like leaving my clinic and moving out to California and all these kinds of things, but a readiness inside to stop living in fear and to see how much it was pervading my view. That to me was a very powerful point, though, yes, several layers and steps that led me to that point of readiness.
And I know your background's in psychology, but you've also gotten into the spiritual aspect. What are you focusing on more? How are you balancing that out now, and why are you doing that? How'd you reach that conclusion?
Yeah. I'm doing it really just because it's how it's unfolded for me. When I took those steps for myself, I'd studied psychoanalysis and attachment theory, and I'd worked from a, trauma-focused lens. And I got just really interested in the world of trauma because it was taking over psychology. You couldn't, any therapist who wasn't speaking about trauma seemed to be, missing the boat on something. And so, when I was at the clinic I was working with young kids and families and high conflict couples, and I loved all of it, but I was still getting sick. And so as I started to pursue those more expansive or just different ways of knowing, it just became clear to me that it wouldn't be aligned for me to keep showing up and doing a more traditional version of this work for others, when for myself I was starting to explore other realms because I'd exhausted the landscapes of traditional psychology and medicine for myself. So it couldn't be that I was going to keep these parts of my life separate. So the personal and the professional started to merge, and everything that I offer to others is really an integration of what I've learned for myself. So the psychology is a part of me. It's absolutely an aspect of how I've learned about psychological dynamics and relationship and attachment, as well as about the nervous system. But also, in terms of my awakening or expansion or readiness to pivot, I started recognizing more intuitive gifts. And when I started healing, I also started recognizing that, for example, when I would meditate or meditate before clients, I started receiving messages. And, it can sound like a woo or abstract thing to talk about, but rather than identify necessarily where the origins of those messages come from, whether I say they come from a divine source or spirit guides or just intuitive knowing, it's clear that it doesn't come from the thinking mind. It's clear that it's a different source because it's not really about me. And a lot of times it's not even based in my own conditioned beliefs. But I started out doing that because I had been working with others who were clearly channeling other sources of knowing. That it just resonated with me. It lit me up. It sparked something. And as I was healing, I see sort of trauma healing and intuitive development as two sides of the same coin, because as we begin to heal that fear conditioning, another space opens up, a space, we can call it in the heart space, for honoring creativity, for just a source of knowing that flows with ease, that is not based on anything but love and creation and wanting to be of service. And that started to flow. So with clients, I would start to receive messages, and maybe it would just be sort of visual metaphors about where they're at or emotions they were coping with or things at first. And I wouldn't necessarily bring it in. I'd sort of do what I was trained to do, but naturally it would start to show up. I started getting very interested in epigenetic and ancestral lineages and recognized that part of what I was receiving could be applied to ancestral lineages of trauma, what people were carrying, whether it was really just originating within them or from the lineage. And so I would start to play with those ideas. And what I noticed is that when I would bring that stuff in at a person's own level of readiness, they would start to cultivate intuition, because as I would bring people into the heart space, a very similar process that unfolded for me, they would start to get messages about themselves. So really the work, rather than me just being this channel for guided messages, is actually teaching people how to cultivate that intuitive compass and knowing within themselves, which leads all of us to a place of discernment to make choices that serve us rather than choices that are based in fear.
That's amazing and makes complete sense as well. And that's what I found too, from my background is I wanted to do it on myself first. I didn't get into this to necessarily share it with other people originally. I was just on my own healing journey. I didn't know, didn't have any other intentions or anything like that. I just knew I needed to heal. And the traditional path didn't really help me at all. In fact, sometimes it even made it worse. So I'm not saying people should avoid it. They should definitely try that in a lot of circumstances. But if they're hitting a wall, then I completely understand that, because that's where I was as well. And then for years, nothing worked. And then I found this path and stuff started working. I was actually making progress and getting past barriers I normally couldn't. So this was like, wait, is this really happening? And then I became much more open-minded. I still think people should be skeptical, because there's still BS and scams out there for sure. But I'm like, well, whatever this is, it's working. So I would try more things. And once I found something that worked for me, I wanted to share it with other people. I was like, oh, I got to help get this out there. And not to say that the stuff that did work for me was bad, just, it did resonate with me as well. That's the approach, like how I kind of fell into it. And I'm noticing even now, if I'm hitting a wall, like if my business gets slow, it seems almost like a message to take a step back and continue to go back to the healing on myself. It's like, don't fall out of that, because there's always work to be done. This path, for me at least, is a lifelong one. So there's always something I could do. And I do have a personal practice, but that's like a sign to even go deeper than that,
Because at the end of the day, and this was in Many Lives, Many Masters, that's all there is our own journey. That's all there is. And we can show up as guides or healers or clinicians or whatever we want to call ourselves as people of service. But the highest service we offer is just to be the light within ourselves. That the healing journey is what is a medicine for others. That being that light and learning how to, cultivate the life that we want, to cultivate the emotion states that we want to live in. This is how we offer ourselves to others. And this is why, clinicians or therapists or whoever can only guide people as far as they're willing to go in themselves. Because if you can't know it, not just intellectually, but if you can't know it in an embodied witnessing experience way, you're not going to have a belief that's expansive enough to allow in another person to expand or to find states of bliss and joy. It's one of the reasons why I think getting really attached to constructs of diagnoses like depression and anxiety are limited, because we actually don't see the possibilities for healing those conditions, or many people don't. So if therapists are working with that framework, you're sort of creating the environment of a box in which, we'll sort of guide you in how to manage this, and maybe there'll be some medication involved, but ultimately it may always be something that you struggle with, and that may be the belief of the person who's espousing it. And so for me, it's like you said, firstly, which is just doing what works and finding what works. And if things aren't working, then keep seeking until you find what works, and be willing to expand the possibilities, recognize the boxes that you might be seeking within, and, practice being open to possibilities beyond that. And if you don't know what's out there, just just ask, set an intention to be like, universe, even if you don't believe it, just try it, ask the universe to show you or to bring a person into your life or a book into your life or a modality into your life that just takes you one step further beyond what you thought was possible in the realm of healing.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because I've given that advice to at least a couple people of like something I did that worked. And it's basically just asking the universe for something too. But I tell them, what do you have to lose? You can do it in private. No one will know you did it. You don't have to tell me you did it, so it's not going to embarrass you. Worst case scenario, what'd you waste? Like 1 to 3 minutes of your time? So there's really nothing to lose here. So I'm like, this does work, and why not try it? So I have said stuff like that.
But I also empathize and I sympathize because it took me, and I think this is the gift or the medicine of trauma or pain and sickness is it took me a place of deep desperation to be willing to seek outside the boxes so I can understand why other people might need conditions or circumstances that bring them to the edge, to be willing to expand.
And the other thing you said that was great too was just people have to be willing to go there as well. And I could tell you obviously are on the empathic side, very much so. Was that hard for you to realize that, like, not even just clients, but friends, like you saw what they needed to do that could help them out, but at the same time, they weren't really willing to get there. So did you just know to hold back or learn just they have to come to me when they're ready or do it when they're ready and not take a personal involvement in that role? Because then it could end up hurting me.
It was actually very liberating because I'd sort of felt those tensions. Particularly, I think most of us feel them in our family, wanting our parents or siblings to change or adjust in certain ways, and truly honoring that that's their journey, and it's really not for us. It's completely based in ego to think that it is up to us to change their journeys. But when you study to be a clinician, then suddenly you're donned this identity that is maybe supposed to be the one who is injecting guidance or injecting wisdom and medicine and facilitating change. And a lot of how that was shaping up where I was working is your caseloads would just be packed and overflowing because plenty of people need help, but rarely would we sit and consider whether people were actually ready, because the way the model works is if people are coming for help, we're going to assist them. But when I left the clinic and sort of structured my life and the way that I offered my services and the way I talked about and wrote about my work, what happened was a natural filter developed because, the way I speak isn't for everybody and the way I write isn't for everybody. And so the people that started to find me were just coming from a different place. Maybe it was a place of desperation because they'd exhausted more traditional medical and psychological landscapes, but maybe it was also a place of openness to some of the intuitive or energetic realms that I was speaking to. Something had resonated in them. And truthfully, if I don't get a yes to, it's not really about money. If I don't get a yes to work with someone, I will very gently and kindly say that, it's not aligned. So I've developed filters and practices to create the fertile environment for me to be as effective as I can with the most aligned people ready to receive it. Because I don't believe we're meant to work with everyone. I don't believe everyone is meant to heal at any time. And I do my best to honor everyone's journey in that way.
Which makes sense why we go through our own situations and different situations is we get that expertise in handling and healing that situation or multiple situations. And that's what we can really share that knowledge with other people as well. And you're right. It's not everyone's going to be right for you too. And I have that say, it's like, we're not Burger King, we're not just trying to get clients or customers for the sake of it. It's just growth.
It's not a numbers game.
Yeah, that would be a very bad idea, like if you're doing this type of work. So I could definitely see that going wrong. And there's going to be people who are right for you that aren't right for me and vice versa. And we all, as we were talking about at the beginning, we all have our different skills and experiences and gifts as well. We're all different. And those are things I try to tell people. It doesn't always set in, but it's like we're here to be the best version of ourselves. Like what worked for me might not work for you. I could give you these tools, but you can make it your own as well.
And embodying this way of learning how to create a practice or a structure of offering that stays in alignment also protects us. It protects our energy, and we can practice letting go of attachment to the results or successes or how people healed or didn't, because that's ultimately about them. And yes, we can certainly, it's not to eschew responsibility and take ownership for our own stuff and how we show up, and if we make mistakes or if we're in alignment with what we're saying, we should absolutely own that. But how a person receives it is totally going to be up to them, and beginning to let go of some of the ego attachment and identity to how good of a healer, how helpful we are, because really it's ultimately, for me, continues to be, it's a very personal journey. The way I show up for others continues to be the way I show up for myself. And if I continue to show up for myself, I trust that it will be of value.
Exactly. And if someone was tuning in today and they resonate with what you said, how can they reach out to you or find you? And what would you recommend? Would you just start with a regular session, or are there different things you could do for them?
The best way for people to find me or reach me would be through my website at drdanielatkins.com. I also have an Instagram, drdaniel_Atkins. And what I typically say to people who are reaching out is we can just set up a brief, free, like 15 to 20 minute conversation over. I typically work virtually, although I have some in-person offerings too. But yeah, just a chance to connect and see how I can be of service if it's in alignment. I work with individuals, also groups too, but yeah, just an initial conversation.
Thank you for coming in and sharing all this. You're definitely very knowledgeable on a lot of these topics and had a lot of experience too, which I'm thankful that you're sharing with others and just sharing this path with you.
Thanks so much, Johnny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad you got to hear Dr. Daniel Atkins' story today. We have another great episode coming up. Please like, follow, and subscribe so you can be notified when it comes out. There's a Patreon. Any amount you can donate is greatly appreciated. Be seeing you.
You've been listening to the Dystopian Renaissance. Spirituality, healing, consciousness, truth. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review the show. And tell a friend or two. That would help also. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hook up with us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at the Dystopian Renaissance. And please find the website at www.thedystopianrenaissance.com.